Hey, all right. So what I'd like to do is zoom out a bit and talk about the framework in which some of these new structures are going to be emerging. We have had a framework over the period of our lifetime and decades before of continual economic growth. And so I think it's typical that most people assume that this is something that goes way back in history, it's normal, it's something that we all want and expect, and it can continue more or less forever. That's simply not supported by the facts. Economic growth, in fact, is something that's pretty recent in human history, and it happened as a result of some unique circumstances. First of all, when we're talking about economic growth, we're really talking about the growth of economies starting out in the Western world, the European economies. And so the European expansion throughout the rest of the world produced a lot of wealth for European economies, and then that was built upon and expanded dramatically by the fossil fuel revolution more recently. Now, just in the last few decades, growth is starting to stall out. Now, economists recognize this, but generally believe that it's due to some problems inherent within the system that we can work out so we can get back to normal. But we have to remember that normal, in fact, is a condition of no growth. It's the growth bubble that's the remarkable thing that requires explanation. The idea that there are inherent limits to growth is certainly not an original or new one. This was discussed as far back as 1972 when a team of scientists at MIT used a computer to look at the likely interactions between population expansion, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. And the most likely scenario, the standard run scenario, showed a peaking and decline in world industrial output sometime in the first half of this century, the 21st century. So what we're actually seeing may in fact be simply the outworking of some more or less inevitable trends. And I'm going to talk about two of them, energy and climate. Now, energy is important to understand because it's really the basis of everything. The economy doesn't work on money, it works on energy. Without energy, nothing happens. We human beings have used energy forever, originally in the forms of food and firewood and muscle power, but more recently in the form of fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are unique in all of human history. Nature produced them over the course of millions of years, concentrated sunlight. If you've ever had the experience of running out of gas in your car and pushing your car off to the side of the road, you have some kind of intuitive recognition of just how powerful fossil fuels are. Imagine pushing your car, say, 20 or 30 miles. Well, we get that done for us with a single gallon of gasoline, for which we're paying $3. What is pushing your car 20 or 30 miles? How much work is that? Maybe 6 or 8 weeks of hard labor, for which, again, we're paying $2 or $3. That's incredibly cheap energy. We discovered buried treasure, and we've been spending it as fast as we can ever since. And that's the real basis of most of the economic growth that we've seen. Now, fossil fuels are depleting non-renewable resources that we've extracted using the low-hanging fruit principle. So it's not as though we're about to run out of coal, natural gas, or oil, but we've got the best of them. And as time goes on, we have to expend more and more effort, more and more money, and more energy to get the next increment of fossil fuels out of the ground. That means we're bumping up against the law of diminishing returns. And that is part of what is causing growth to slow down. This is just what's happening in the oil industry. The same thing will be happening with natural gas and coal in slightly delayed fashion, but we're not talking about decades and decades from now. We're talking about really the next few years. This is an ongoing, real-time experience that we're having here of increasing costs and diminishing returns. Now, oil is hard to substitute. There are different ways of substituting for oil. We can drive electric cars, for example, but we're not going to drive electric, or we're not going to fly electric airliners because the batteries would be too heavy. Similarly, electric 18-wheel trucks, bulldozers, and so on, very unlikely. So we're really looking at a very different kind of future as we transition away from fossil fuels. Now, the most likely substitute energy sources for fossil fuels will be renewable sources like solar and wind. Nuclear globally is not growing, it's going away, and for very good reasons. And if you start looking around at other potential energy sources, there's really not that much there. Most of the growth that's occurring now is in renewables. And we want and we need more renewable sources of energy. However, wind and solar are inherently intermittent sources of energy. The wind isn't always blowing, sun isn't always shining. There are ways of making up for that with energy storage, by creating massive redundancy of generation capacity. But these things cost money and energy. Another difficulty that we have to overcome in this next energy transition is the fact that the last energy transition to fossil fuels was an additive one. We just kept adding new sources of energy to what we already had. We're still using firewood, right? Whereas we're talking about changing out almost all of our current energy sources for different ones. Also, we created our massive current infrastructure for using energy on the basis of expectations based around the qualities and characteristics and quantities of energy that we were getting from fossil fuels. So this is going to be a lot of work, and a lot of things can go wrong. Generally speaking, our energy future is going to be less mobile, more localized, and we're likely to have a lot less energy to play with. And that energy will have different characteristics. Rather than being, 24/7 available on demand, it will be, we will need to organize our use of energy around when and how energy is available to be used. We're going to have to understand the difference between and relationship between operational energy, which is the gasoline you put in the car tank, and embodied or embedded energy, the energy it took to build the car, to build the road that the car is driving on, and all the gas stations and all the other systems that make it possible for you to drive a car. Now, that's one example, but think about how this plays out in the built structures and infrastructures of our society, and in the products that we use, the food that we consume, how much of that is embodied, how much energy is embodied in the food that we use, in terms of food miles, in terms of packaging, and so on. So here are some of the structural considerations that we're going to be dealing with as we move into the new energy era with regard to food. With regard to water, with regard to resource extraction, with regard to construction of buildings, with regard to manufacturing. Thank you. And transportation. You know, we're going to have to start thinking about modes of transportation. Now, energy is one of the two big areas that I want to touch on that have to do with the end of economic growth as we've known it. The other is climate change. We know that climate change is a world-altering, planet-altering impact of our current energy use, fossil fuels, energy sources, a set of energy sources. If climate change continues as on the course it's currently set on, the result will be the end of economic growth as we've known it, and in fact the end of probably civilization as we've known it. But if we choose to do something about climate change, what would that mean? That would mean rapidly and dramatically getting off of fossil fuels. Well, in order to make enough of a difference, we would have to do that so fast as to curtail growth also. So any way you look at it, you know, the same future awaits us. We've been told that growth is good for us, it's inevitable, it's necessary, jobs, returns on investments, tax revenues for governments, and so on. But the fact is we live on a finite planet. And the economy, as we've built it, is in fact an engine. It's a thermodynamic engine for taking labor and nature and churning it up and turning it into pollution. So the post-growth economy is inevitable. It's going to look very, very different from what we are used to now, necessarily so. And it's going to be a good thing. We hear about the sharing economy and the burgeoning of the sharing economy and the localization movement. These are just the early stages of transition and transformation to the post-growth economy. I want to leave you with the thought that the post-growth economy is not an option, it's inevitable. The creative challenge of our time is to anticipate it, to imagine it, and to pre-adapt so that others, as time goes on, will have an easier time doing so themselves. And I wish you all good cheer in doing so. Thank you.